One of the big issues with games is that unfortunately it just takes a long time to make games. Like sure, there's like technical difficulties and things like that, but it kind of just comes down to being able to stick to making a game for at a bare minimum usually 3 months and more likely up to 3 years before you actually see that game come to completion. So it takes a long time to make games. But I think part of it is also that developers during that time find themselves in these traps, these game dev time wastes basically, where they may be spending days, weeks, or even months going down rabbit holes that they honestly should not be spending time on. So in today's video, I've compiled a list of 7 of the top game development time wastes that I just want to make you aware of, and hopefully you're not doing any of them or just a few of them, and maybe you can reconsider of like, hey, should I be doing this? The first thing that developers run into that's kind of a time waste, and trust me on this, it's gonna sound like a little bit weird, but it's that you're over polishing on stuff that doesn't matter. Where you see these developers and they're kind of just working on their game and they're like, okay, I just need to make the game better. I need to make the game better. I'm gonna give it more game fun. I'm gonna give it more juice. I'm gonna do all of these things, but they don't have enough feedback to know what parts of their game actually matter. And yeah, you could spend more time polishing every single part of your game, but there is kind of a return on investment. You know, it's the 80-20 thing of like, with 20% of the effort, you can get 80% of the result. And you have that with polishing as well, where sure, certain things you wanna hyper polish, like the core parts of your gameplay. Like for example, I think something that you wanna have like hyper polish is in Bellatro. You have like, you know, the animations of like where the cards flip and then the number goes up and you have like all of the like flames and shit like that. You want to over polish that. But other parts of your game, you don't really need to polish that much. You do that 20% and you get 80% of the results. So you have more time to spend on that like 1 or 2 things that is like very core to your gameplay loop that yes, you should absolutely polish the shit out of. If you do not know what that specific thing is, you're going to run into the trap of trying to over polish everything. And that's that problem of like the last 20% takes 80% of the time, multiply that by 10 mechanics or however much things you need to over polish. And suddenly you're spending months of time on something that people may not even notice. And even if they do notice, it wouldn't really impact their overall feelings on the game that much anyway. So here it's just getting feedback, having builds up on itch.io or even having demos up and eternally trying to iterate, asking people, hey, what should we do here? Try to get playtesters, try to get like, see other people play your game, going to game dev events. There's a lot of, you know, standard stuff you can do here. You just need to talk to people and not just stay stuck in your own mind with no external feedback of like, I'm just going to make everything the best game possible versus just knowing what is the things that I should focus on the most right now. That brings us to the second thing, and this is something that I think only really happens if you're a honestly like real like beginner developer, and that is endless world building. I know as well, when we first started game development, we were going to make an open world RPG. Because who did it? Like, we genuinely were. And it was like, okay, I'll be the narrative guy. I'm gonna write like the lore and the story and the world building, and you're spending so much time on stuff that doesn't really matter. I think once you've like released like 1 or 2 games, you kind of realize like, yeah, I should not be making this style of game, and I shouldn't like be spending this time on like world building and writing because I'm not a good writer. But especially in the beginning, you feel like, you know, game development is 100% creative expression for you at that point. And you know what is creative? It is coming up with character names and writing dialogue and making like the city layout plans and all of those like real like hardcore world building stuff that honestly, even if you are making an RPG game, do not really matter that much at the start, where you're kind of also wondering more of like, okay, what are my mechanics going to be once again? How am I going to stand out from other RPGs? Because let me tell you, writing an RPG game that is only standout in the terms of writing means that you need to be a really cracked writer to begin with, which probably you aren't yet. And the problem is that it's kind of 50 times, 100 times easier to come up with town names and floor plans and all of those things than it is to 1, actually implement them in your game, or 2, just work on your game in general, like writing code. So your brain is going to automatically drift back towards, oh, I'm going to plan out my world more, I'm going to make my level design and all of that. And suddenly you've spent 2 months on this very big like Unity scene or whatever that is like your entire world, but there is 0 playable for your game. Like, yeah, sure, maybe you have a third-person controller and you can walk around, but your game hasn't really progressed that much, basically, because you're focusing on stuff that is not 100% directly related to the game. And if you're not interested in the game dev part, I think this is a good like filter almost. It's like, you know, there is nothing wrong with wanting to write, with wanting to run D&D campaigns or anything like that. I think it's just important to have that distinction of, am I making a game or am I making a story? And sure, of course there is overlap between those two, but I think if you're making a game, story can be important depending on the style of game you're making, but it shouldn't be like 100% super important for your game. It needs to be also about, is the game that I'm making a fun game to begin with? And it's one of those things that is also, there's no clear end definition of like, okay, now my story is done, now I can start working on the game. No, because you're going to keep updating it for potentially years on end, at a point where you don't even know, once again, if you want to make the game itself or just make the story. Kind of going into this RPG thing as well, this brings us to number 3, and that is kind of creating engines inside of your engine. What do I mean by this? This is something that our audience has as well, because you guys are primarily programmers, I would say. I have spoken to so many people at this point who are making like games, and every single one of them basically gets this conversation if they have any sort of dialogue in their game. It's like, yeah, I'm working on my game and I just spent the last like 2 weeks writing my own custom implementation for dialogue and I think it's the best thing ever. And I've heard this like genuinely like 50 times from 50 different developers where they, how do I say, hyper optimize parts of the game that they once again do not have validation of, like, am I even going to do dialogue like this in the full game? Do people even care about my dialogue? Maybe I'm gonna scrap this system. And instead they are kind of like, you know, they see there's more fun almost in building the systems for making their game than in actually making the game. I think this is a problem you see a lot with programmer first game developers, where they kind of think about, like, how am I going to scale this up to 10,000 different dialogue entries or something before they actually realize, okay, if I just hard code 5 different dialogue pop-ups, how does this feel in game already? And they skip that part entirely and they just go straight to, okay, I'm now going to make my entire custom Unity asset basically for making dialogue trees. And at that point, you know, the cope also comes in. This is not hating on you guys. It's just a funny thing of, like, once I talk to these people, it's like, yeah, I spent so much time on it. And then they ask me like, oh, do you think I should like polish it up even a little bit more and just make it a standalone asset? And the answer to that is no, because there are already so many dialogue assets out there. And what's the reason you didn't want to use a dialogue asset to begin with as well? It's always like, oh, there is this one feature that this other asset doesn't have. That's going to be the case for everything. If you want to like sell assets on the Unity asset store, do not make dialogue assets basically. But dialogue is one example. There's other things as well, like for example, quest building, mechanic building, and to a certain degree, yes, these things matter if you're scaling your game in the production stage. But I see developers in the pre-production stage where, once again, they don't have that validation yet, spending, once again, weeks or months on systems that do not right now have a clear indicator of these are actually worth it. And I know some people are like yelling at me right now, like, oh, but I need to make them worth it now. And it's like, yeah, just refactor. Sure, the refactor will also cost time. I know that, but it's better to have that potential of, okay, maybe I'm going to have to refactor this 3 months down the line when I already know, okay, this is actually something worth doing, versus upfront having to spend a month of time on something that you do not even know if you will ever complete the project, basically, because you're going to be moving forward so slow with your game because the rest of the game can't progress while you're working on the dialogue system, that your motivation bar for that game also starts to dwindle. And before you know it, you have spent an entire month making that dialogue system, and now you zoom out again, you look at your game and you're like, what was I even doing here again? And I think that is just such a big trap, basically, that I want you to prevent from having. And that brings us to the 4th point, which is kind of similar, but it's premature optimization, where once again, you have these people and they're making their game, and then suddenly they switch to like Unity dots, or they implement ECS or whatever, and they implement it of like, oh yeah, it's gonna be more performant, when their game could already run at like 200 plus FPS on a modern PC. I think at some point you need to understand, like, yeah, 120 FPS, 200 FPS, however much is enough, where we have this sometimes as well with our programmers, of like, where they are like optimizing our entire code to like the highest degree possible, and it's like, so what does this do? And they're like, oh, this is like a 0.3% performance improvement or something. And to a certain degree, you know, you need to have those breaks sometimes of like pushing yourself forward a bit. But on the other hand, once again, similar to those systems, you shouldn't worry too much about like optimization and all of that before you once again have validation. And even then, you know, hot takes, you shouldn't worry about optimization. It's maybe a crazy take, but I think you overestimate the importance of optimization almost to an entire degree, where usually, once again, 80-20 rule, you can just make your entire game somewhat unoptimized, and then a month before launch, once again, you have your 80-20 rule. You can optimize like 80% of the big issues for like 20% of the total time and effort, and often that is good enough already. You can of course be like, hey, I'm gonna optimize my game so it can also run on a Nintendo Switch 1 or something, which yeah, then you need to make a lot of sacrifices, but having those sacrifices then of hyper optimizing your game may actually slow you down even more during the development itself, and especially that premature optimization, because then you need to take into consideration all of those optimizations, and maybe it changes how you do your workflow as well. Now that I'm recording this video, I'm also starting to like see like some trends of like most of the things are honestly like very telltale beginner signs, I guess, or like you see these comments on like beginner focused videos, and it is developers who are also just chasing the perfect tool set. And you know, we sometimes get like comments of like, oh, but how do you have like your Notion setup or your Kanban board or all of those things for your game? Like, what if I need to set up my build pipelines for my game? Which once again, they're trying to, especially coming in from that software engineering background, they start up their game and immediately they're like, yeah, I'm going to set up my entire build pipeline for Windows builds, Mac OS builds, demo build versus full game build, and then like it's all gonna run automated with different branches and things like that. Once again, you spend like we had some guys on our team doing that. You spent weeks or even months on perfecting your workflow, for lack of a better word, of like, I need to have all of these things, when in reality it's really not that complicated to make a game, I would say. Of course, if you're making like very big games, you're going to need to have some sort of documentation thing. For some people, they swear by Obsidian. For some people, they swear by Notion. There's a lot of different approaches. How we do it is we have Notepad and we have like just like a task list on paper. And that's how we work together in a team. And we still manage to make that work. If you're working like AAA studios, yeah, you need to have like all of these systems and wikis. We've tried all of those things as well. We've worked with Kanban boards before. We've worked with centralized wiki systems before. But they always just slowed us down and they didn't really benefit us that much, I would say, either. And especially, once again, if you're a solo developer, if you're making your first few games, it doesn't matter, you have that much documentation. I think that also brings you into that trap, or like not documentation, but like all of those systems around you. It brings you in that trap once again of like kind of like you're gonna start world building and you're going to write down all of this information that doesn't really matter. You need to have a general idea of like what is everything that needs to happen. And for us, that was just a checklist with like 150 entries. And that was the entire game. And we just worked through that entire checklist for example, Unicycle Pizza Time. And once that was done, the game was mostly done. Of course, more things will show up, but you do not need like a super advanced tool. Of course, if you have one that works, if you work better with Codex or you work better with Obsidian, that's fine, but try to at least be aware of that you're not spending like weeks on end ping-ponging between all of these different systems. I'm gonna try Monday.com and then Asana and all of those ones, where in reality, you know, if you're just going to full-time project manage yourself, you're not going to have time to work on the game itself anymore by having all of that like extra overhead, basically. And then this next one is kind of a... And when I wrote this down, it was kind of a hard one, because on the one hand, it's kind of good. On the other hand, it's also very much a trap. And that is scope creep and genre blending, where you might be working on a game and then one day, I don't know, whether you're in the shower, on the toilet, or just working on the game itself, you get this idea, what if we add fishing? What if we add trains? What if we add Souls-like combat to this game? And for the most part, you know, scope creep. First of all, you put up your hand in the air and say scope creep, but that doesn't mean that scope creep is always bad. That's, I think, a pretty interesting topic, maybe for a video for another time. Sometimes scope creep is needed. Sometimes your game isn't good enough on its own, and having that like one extra change, whether that be fishing or trains or whatever, can completely change the dynamic of your game, give it that unique twist that you may have been looking for, and give it more clarity towards where you want to go. And that's great. But sometimes, more often than not probably, it is just scope creep and extra time wasting. Or you're trying to also, I think that a bigger problem is not just scope creep of like, okay, let's add fishing, and then you're like, okay, but we should add different fishing rods. And what if we add like automated fishing boats now? So, and suddenly you're adding like 15 new mechanics in that one, like, oh, let's add fishing. That's like one kind of issue. And then the other issue is, like I said, of like, oh, what if we add Souls-like combat to this game that is not really designed for Souls-like combat, where if you're going to like blend genres together as well, you may actually stray away further from what made your game like work in the first place. So this is kind of a double-edged sword. This is something that unfortunately only comes with experience, I would say, where on the one hand, you can get this idea and it's going to take an extra month of development time, but it's going to absolutely save your game and give it that twist that's needed. Or you're going to get this idea and you're going to think it's the greatest thing ever and you're going to spend a month of time on it. And if you're lucky, you're going to realize that it was a dumb idea. If you're unlucky, you're still going to think it's a great idea. Even though, and especially with like genre blending, the only thing you've done then, and this is the big danger, is that you've made a game that appeals to nobody. Because let's say I add Souls-like combat to my tower defense game. I don't know, I'm just making shit up right now. I have this game that is very appealing to tower defense people. I knew that, or maybe you didn't know that. And then you add Souls-like combat, thinking that, hey, I'm now going to double my pool of like people who are interested in Souls-likes will like this game, and people who are interested in tower defense games will like this game. When in reality, you're kind of mixing two things that people do not want. Genre blending, you know, it's like I like ice cream and I like eating steak, but that doesn't mean that I want to eat ice cream with my steak at the same time. Certain things have certain like right places, right times. And by making a game that tries to appeal to everyone, you're going to make a game that appeals to nobody. God, this feels like a commentary on modern AAA gaming at this point. But you should be aware of those things as well and try to be vigilant, especially about changing the genre or adding new genres to your game. Adding some scope creep, honestly, one, it's unavoidable, and two, it can often be the solution that you didn't know you needed. But I would still be very careful with like adding new stuff, basically. And the lost time waste, and this is one that is always a hard one, of course, is doing everything yourself, where there is just not enough time unless you want to release one game before you fall dead on the ground on this earth, basically. Where you go in and you're like, I'm going to write the story, I'm going to do the coding, I'm going to do the art, I'm going to do the 3D models as well, like 2D art, 3D art, I'm going to do all the marketing. You are going to have to wear a lot of hats as a game developer, like different roles. That's going to happen regardless, but that doesn't mean you need to wear every single hat. There are still decisions that we just outsource completely, basically. That is also stuff like, you know, not making an engine from scratch. That is things like using asset packs for your UI, for your environment, for 3D art, even for coding frameworks. And like, you know, depending on the genre, you have like a lot of asset packs for like city builders, tower defense games, horror games, all of those. Using those to speed up your game can often help as well. Even like dumb stuff, like for example in our game, like we use like CRT shaders, and it's like, I could maybe figure out how to get a CRT shader working in Unity and like write my own stuff with shader graph, or I could just spend $10 and I have a shader, and it's going to probably be better than what I need. And if I do still miss something, I can still even send the guy an email and be like, hey, do you support this? How would we add this? Is this possible? And often than not, especially with these asset developers, you'll get an answer and maybe they'll add it if it's not like too much of an issue. That's what I've realized as well. Or like they'll give you pointers on how can you extend this without having to spend that much time. That was once again something that happened for us. It's something that is once again, I can say this, I can yell this off the rooftops, but it's just so hard to internalize for developers, unfortunately. Like, hey, actually, yeah, maybe I shouldn't be doing everything myself. Some people, they do recognize the value because yeah, it's going to cost some money. Most likely, which is why Godot developers, I feel, never want to buy asset packs. But it is just like, you know, the best example of this was when we made our first game and we wrote like our own localization toolkit ourselves. And it genuinely was a nightmare to work with. It was something that took like, I would say like 50 hours or something total work for like writing the toolkit, writing the tool in to like make like our CSV imports and exports, making like all of the use cases, like our font switching and whatever. It took a long time. And then the second game, we were like, never again. And we bought like an asset I2 localized. You don't even need to buy an asset for Unity now anymore. Like the Unity built-in localization is pretty okay at this point. And it saved us like so much time for $40. And it's like, why would we have spent 50 hours when we could have also spent $40? And that is something that we now also are getting more familiar with. That doesn't mean that you like, you know, every single piece of art needs to be custom commissioned and all of that. Absolutely not. And you can still make a lot of your game yourself, but just the things that you realize like, hey, actually, I really don't want to do pixel art, or I really don't want to do like this specific part of game development. Look if there's assets for it. See if you can find just music sound packs instead of learning how to make music yourself and all of that. And trust me, it's going to save you so much time. It's going to be something that allows you to make small games. I think you cannot make small games if you try to do everything yourself. There will always be certain considerations and certain things that you need to keep in mind in order to make games in moderate time frames, talking 3 months, 6 months, or even 12 months from start to finish. Doing everything yourself in these games is often than not kind of impossible. And I really ask you not to have that idea of I am a game developer and I need to do everything myself. So those were my 7 big time wasters. I'm curious, how many of these are you actively doing versus like how many of these have you also done before? I'm pretty sure we've done all of these at some point in our game development career. I am very happy now that 4 years into our game development career, I would say I'm very vigilant about them and we don't really make those mistakes again anymore. And if you're interested in just following us along and seeing what else we used to do maybe mistakes-wise before that we've learned and we've improved upon to kind of help you speed up, then go ahead and subscribe down below there, because we upload 2 videos every week on this channel talking about our experience with game development and the things that we learn along the way. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff for you to hear. We're on the path to build $1 million studio in 2026, and I just want to share that journey with you. So I hope you want to join us with that as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!